As quilters, we all have our favorite pattern, our favorite quilt block for that matter, that we tend to go to because it's quick, it's easy, we can get a quilt done for somebody really fast, and that's great. Pull some fabric and boom, there we are, we have a quilt. But sometimes it's also fun to have a little trick up your sleeve, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. If you look at these quilts in the back, a number of them you've seen in previous videos, but what they all have in common is the no-waste flying geese block, and that's what I want to show you today. I'm Louise from Inspired Quilting by Louise, and after making many of these no-waste flying geese blocks, I have found some tips and techniques that will make it so much easier for you. Just a few things to watch as you go along. There can be some little problems that occur or some tight spots that you need to get out of. This is going to help you through that so that your finished flying geese block is perfect, beautiful, and pieces together in your quilt very easily. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. Now, if you like the video, please give me a thumbs up. I hope you subscribe so we can do some more quilting again in the future. But right now, it's time to quilt. Let's go. I have used this no-waste flying geese method in quite a few quilts recently. And I really wanted to show you up close and personal how to make each one to get all these points to line up so that we're not losing anything, to get even size blocks. And after making a bunch of these, I wanted to show you some of the things that I've learned that makes it a bit easier. Now, you can do something just as simple as this and just use the flying geese, you know, in alternating directions in rows. And this is a Tulip Pink collection. And I love just the way all the bright fabrics work together, and there are plenty of, I don't want to say low volume, these are hardly low volume, but they can certainly stand in as a background. And as long as you get a good contrast with your fabrics, you're going to have that stand out really well. So this is one way, and this, I'll include the video up above because this was a free pattern that I found online that I'll go ahead and share with you. So there's that one. Now, from there, actually, I'm going to put this one last because that's the one we're making today. So then from there, I did this, and I really like how these big stars turn out with a low volume background. And then by using these corners consistently, you create a little bit of a secondary pattern in there. Let's see if I can open this up. There we go. And so you've got these squares between your stars. And this is a K Facet collection. This was lipstick. I actually did this one out of Layer Cakes. The flying geese I did out of Fat Quarters, and this one's out of Layer Cake. So this pattern's very flexible, or I should say this block is very flexible in how you can start and what pre-cuts you use or yardage, whatever works for you. But this works out really well, and again, it's about these points because here's our flying geese. Do you see that right here? That's the same as this one right here. Now, I made these a bit larger, but it's the same method, the same technique of putting it together. But what's important here are these points. And we don't want to lose those points as we're sewing our quilt together. And especially when you've got, I mean, here we've got 4 on each side, so that's 8 points coming together. And it doesn't look too bad. It came out pretty darn well. And it's just about learning how to put these together. And it's the assembly of the block itself. From the very first seam you make for these flying geese, it's the technique that you use that's going to bring you really good results. Now here's another one that I did, and this too was done out of Layer Cakes. K Facet, oh my goodness, what was this one? It wasn't Peacock. Anyways, It's another one, and I can put links to these because I do have a video on this one, and I should also have a video on this one, just so you can see how they go together and the individual blocks. But this is just really pretty. And what's fun about using a layer cake is you get a lot of different prints that you can pull together, and it just works wonderfully. But again, look at this now. See how these points work? And once you get this block right here, this no waste flying geese, you get this technique down, there is so much you can do. Now, if you've seen many other videos, you know that I absolutely love my low volume fabrics. And that's what this quilt is right here. And let's kind of turn it this way. I think we can see more of it. So what I did, though, that's a bit different is I sewed the star block, and this I used fat quarters. Everything here is fat quarters, and I cut it down for the star as well as the 9 patch. So what I did is alternated the stars with the 9 patch, and I used low volume fabrics. And I chose to go with the 9 patch because this block essentially is like a 16 patch, like 4 by 4. Even though this isn't a seam, proportionately, that's what this block is. And so if I were to do another block of a similar layout with these same number squares, I'm going to have these seams to match up, and, you know, getting the points lined up is a busy enough effort that I don't want to have other squares mixed in there. So I made these blocks larger, and I made it a 9 patch. So you see, these don't line up, which makes this such an easy assembly, putting these blocks together. And I really love these colors, how they turned out. These are a Hoffman Bali Batik collection. I think it's called Sand and Water or Sand and Sea, and it came out earlier this spring, and I absolutely love these colors and prints. And I'll put fabric information and things like that below in the description. But I think this 9 patch alternating between here just really makes this quilt stand out, and those stars become the focal point. Now, when you have a lot of low volume, if you want a particular pattern to stand out, you need some contrast, and I put the contrast in these points. And you can see how these points have, you know, really become more dominant because they are the strongest color. There's more color value or more saturation in the color than the low volume, and therefore they stand out very nicely. And here's another fun one, just some fun prints. And this is the one that the quilt that I'm just finishing, and this is what I'm going to show the demonstration on, how to make these no waste flying geese. So here we are. Let me go ahead and get started. I just wanted you to see how many opportunities there are to use this block and how many different ways you can set up your own patchwork quilt with this kind of a pattern. So let's go ahead and get started. And the first step to making our star is to create the flying geese, and we are going to use the no waste flying geese method, and that requires 1 large square and 4 small squares, and all these dimensions are down in the description below. And I just want to show you how this goes together. Notice that on each of the small squares I've drawn a diagonal line from corner to corner, and that's so I can follow that line to set my seam allowance. So I'm going to line this corner up right there and make sure these corners are evenly spaced. I don't want them, you know, to be tilted off the fabric like that. I want to keep them nice and straight, keep everything square. Now, one of the tricks to this no waste flying geese, after making a few dozen of these, I figured something out that has worked really well for me. If you've ever seen me do half square triangles, you've heard me talk about generous and scant seams. Generous means we're taking just a little bit more than a 1/4 inch. Scant is just a little bit less. And when I say a bit, I'm talking maybe a couple threads. So it's not significant, but it is enough to make a difference. In this case, I want to sew a 1/4 inch seam, but a generous 1/4 inch seam. So just the teeniest bit more. And I'm going to line this up right where I know my 1/4 inch seam is and just give myself a little extra room. And what I'm going to do then is add a couple extra threads into that seam allowance. And I'm going to show you where that's going to make a difference. Now, I'll come about 3/4 of the way down and I'll set the other corner. And we're going to go right across from one side to the other. And so right here, I want to line this corner up and make sure each of the side corners are in line with the block. Now, it's possible that when you're cutting, you might not have gotten things perfectly square, and this block could be a little bit larger and want to fan out on the sides where this may be on the inside. It just depends on how you cut and your accuracy, but what you can do is split the difference. So let's say your block was sticking out this far. Then what you would want to do is turn it so that that distance is equally divided or spaced on each side. And that's going to minimize any drastic problems you may have. Now, I'm going to go ahead and just put a pin here. And that's going to hold my block so I know I can get through this area and have everything straight. I'm going to lift this up and put it over the top. So as I'm sewing, I'm going to go right down over this. The reason being is if I leave this here and I sew, there's a good chance that's going to kick up on me and perhaps fold over, get sewn in the wrong place, and all that drama ensues. So we are going to make sure we don't have a problem. So we get to this point, pull that needle out, and we do our generous 1/4 inch seam all the way through. And let's do one on the other side. And I have to remind myself to take that little bit extra. And now I'm coming to this corner. And there's a couple things you can do. I just get my seam ripper or a stiletto, and I'll just hold this point down as I get close. So I want to get that point under my presser foot. And then I'm just going to hold right here so that it doesn't flip up on me. There we go. And now I can just do a straight run all the way to the other side. And there we go. Now, when you're doing triangles, which essentially the flying geese is, you want to cut off these corners. And there are a number of different ways to do it. But for me, what I do at this point is I just cut that littlest bit off. Maybe it's not even 1/4 of an inch, but it's the dog ear that's going to hang out over the edge of the block after the fact. And so I just trim that off now, don't have to deal with it later, and that just works out really well for me. Now what I want to show you here is that if I put my ruler, let's see, we'll do it this way. I'm going to put a line in the center. I want to say exactly 1/2 inch, but just the slightest bit more than a 1/2 inch seam because we've got a 1/4 on each side. Now, the reason this is important is when I am now going to come back and cut on that line, I'm going to fold this up, and this is going to be my next step in the flying geese. But notice we have a raw edge right here. Let me show you what happens if you don't get the right seam. So right here, I have my line, and I took a generous 1/4 inch seam, and see how this raw edge falls inside. It doesn't hang over excessively. So when I line up this point, okay, this is my center right there, and I'm going to sew across here. I need this to be within that 1/4 inch seam allowance in order for this raw edge not to be exposed on the front of the quilt. So let's say I'm just going to take this straight line on my ruler and line it up with the edge that I've sewn. And if you see from this line to here is 1/4 inch, that fold right there is just shy of 1/4 inch. And that means that this raw edge, let me get my seam ripper again, this raw edge will fall inside the seam. Now, let me show you on the other side. I took a narrow edge or a narrow seam here intentionally to show you. You can see how much more narrow this is compared to that. And you can also see how much wider this part extends. So if you look here, see from here to there, it only comes over that little bit, which is just under 1/4 inch. This extends over more. So when I do my seam right here, so this is my edge, and I'm going to do a 1/4 inch seam, I'm going to have this little tiny raw edge corner sticking out on the surface of my quilt. And while it really isn't noticeable, what will happen over time is as this washes, these threads are going to come loose, and it looks like your quilt's falling apart. It won't, because everything's held together, but you don't want to have those little threads right there. And like I said, I've made a number of these blocks, and I finally figured out I had a couple of them that I had this extending out, and I'm thinking, what on earth is that? I don't understand. Well, it's sort of the geometrics of triangles. So I need to go back and take care of that. And after we've sewn our nice even seams down both sides of the line, we're going to cut this in half. Now, I would recommend doing this with your rotary cutter on the mat. But just for the sake of expedience and the fact that this is just going to make this a whole lot quicker, I'm going to use my trusty scissors. My favorite Gingers, by the way. Love these guys. Okay, so now I have these two pieces, but we're not finished yet. What I'm going to do is press this outward on both sides. Now, the other thing I want to show you, since we're talking about these inside points, I'm going to put this line on the seam, just like this, and I'm going to put this line in the center. So let's see if I can do this on camera. And what you'll notice right here, and I think you can see through the ruler. Here, let me hold it up. I just don't know. I'm going to get right up close. Hopefully the camera can focus in. So see where I have this line right on the seam and this line right in the notch, because that's where I'm going to make my next cut. And see how this little angle is inside that 1/4 inch? So I know that raw edge is not going to be exposed. Now, it's a lot of measuring that you don't necessarily have to do. I just want to show you this so if you have it happen, you know it's a seam allowance issue. And if you go back and look, you may find that one of your seam allowances are particularly thin. So just watch for that as you're doing this, and it's going to make things so much easier. So now, what do we do from here? Let me show you. I'm going to take these and press them, and I'm going to add a block here and a block here. And now what I'm going to do is we're going to continue the same thing. We're going to sew a 1/4 inch up and a 1/4 inch back. Important thing to look at. We know how to line up this corner down here and make sure these side corners, see how there's a little bit overhanging on each side? That's okay. Like I said, we're human. We're not machines. We're not going to get that exact cut, but we can get pretty darn close. And if we know how to compensate for those little variances, we're going to be fine. And that's what I want to share as I'm going along here, how to get a really good no waste flying geese, because there are a few tricks along the way that help. So we've got this. Let me just put a pin right here so I can show you. The important part here is that this point be in the middle of these two pieces that we previously sewed and cut. So you can see that this is evenly in the center. And the reason that's important is when we sew our 1/4 inch, it's going to begin right here. That's where our seam will be, right in that notch there and right into that notch here. And this should be your generous 1/4 inch seam allowance. It'll be just a tad wider. And by doing that, we're going to ensure that we have even star points on either side for our flying geese. So let me show you one that I've already done. I'm going to set this one aside for the moment. And this one we already have finished. So I sewed down both sides, and again, I clip my corners as I go. I do this one, I sew up, down, and come back. I clip here, and I clip here. And then, again, you can decide scissors or rotary, whatever's convenient. Sometimes I find at the sewing machine it's a bit easier just to do this. Now, if I'm making a bunch of these, I would just take them to my cutting mat and do them all at once. All right, so now we have this, and watch. We're going to turn this over and look at that beautiful point. And the beauty of it is there's more than a 1/4 inch from here to here. So if I measure my 1/4 inch seam from here to here, let me get this to lay still. There we go, 1/4 and 1/4. I still have, that's almost 1/8 of an inch, but that's because my ruler keeps sliding off. But you're going to have a little bit of room so that when you sew that seam right there, you're going to be away from the point so that when we sew this and this seam allowance turns over, that point is going to be right on. Now, you might get it so that there's even just a little bit of fabric, and that's okay. Some of my points have turned out that way as well. What's important is that we don't lose that point, because if you nub that off and you lose the tip, that becomes visible. Not critical. You're making wonky stars. We do that all the time. But in this particular case, we want them to be nice and even. So that is the step for making our no waste flying geese. I'm going to go ahead and cut this one. And so now, by using the 1 large square and the 4 small squares, we get our 4 no waste flying geese. These are going to become the star points. So do you see that? So this is the center of my star, and now I have these points, and they're going to be at the top and the bottom and each of the sides. So what I'm going to do next is I would take my center block, and I'll do this on the other one. I'll actually sew it for you. I just want to give you a visual here of how this works. So you see my star coming together here and here. And so I have my center block here. I have my stars. I have corners that are going to go at each outer corner here and here. And it just goes together really well. And this is the secret. It's beautiful. They're perfect. They're wonderful. It's a great way to make flying geese in order to get these blocks here to fit so well and not have to do half square triangles where you have it split down the middle, or do the old-fashioned flying geese where you kind of waste a whole lot of fabric. So this works wonderfully well. And I'm going to get the blocks finished and show you how it goes together. And now we are going to chain piece our blocks together, our star blocks. And we're going to put our corner out here. We have 4 corners that are the background fabric. And I'm just going to make sure these line up nice. And I'm going to use at this point, I'm going to just use a straight 1/4 inch seam. I don't really have to worry about any particular corners, but you don't want to go less than. So you can either use a 1/4 or just a little bit of a generous seam, because we are going to come back and sew right there. And we want to make sure we don't cut that corner off either. So let's go with our anywhere from a quarter to a generous quarter. And then we are going to put our side piece. Oh, look at that. I've got that in the right, yep, I've got it in the right direction. Oh, I've put that upside down so many times on other blocks. So you always want to make sure that this is lining up just where you want it to. And so I am going to put this right here and line it up corner to corner, and it's a perfect fit. Just like this. And now I'm going to cut, well, let's see, I'll do it on the other side. I'll show you, because what I want to show you is how we're going to sew across here on the inside of the point. So these are our points for the star, and this is where we're sewing it to the center right here. This is the white point that's going to show on the front of the quilt in the background, and we want to have that point on the front of the quilt. If we sew up here, we're going to have this little flat spot, and we don't want that. We want to make sure we sew on this side of that corner. And if I line this up just like this, I'm going to pin right here and show you where that point is. So I'm going to put the point right there. And as long as I sew on this side, which is going to be the 1/4 inch, so I've got plenty of room to do it, I'm going to be good. So like on the next one, I'll do it with the point on the top so you can see that seam allowance. But I will flip this over real quick. So you can see, actually I came up a little more than I needed to, but that's okay. It's not going to be a problem. All right, so now we want to have this bottom piece, and so we want these points going this direction. So I'll have my corner square here, and I'm going to attach this piece, and we're just going to keep chain stitching. I just want to make sure these edges line up and that my point lines up in this corner, because that way I'll get an equal seam allowance in both directions. Because if I come in too narrow, that brings this point down. If I come in too wide, it puts the point up. So the 1/4 inch is pretty important when you're doing any kind of angles like this. So we're going to do our 1/4 inch right down, and we have this all pieced nicely. And see, so we now have easily our 1/4 inch seam allowance to sew our blocks together. And the same here. We have, actually that's a little wide. I could go back and tuck that in, but I'm not concerned about that. I'd rather have a little bit more exposed than not to be able to see this at all. And this one right here, we have our 1/4 inch there, so everything's looking fine. Now I'm going to take this here and put the other corner on this side. So essentially when you're making a star, once all the components are pieced, it's a 9 patch. You have 3 blocks across and 3 blocks down. So once you know how to chain piece a 9 patch, the star is easy. And now that you know how to make the no waste flying geese, you can make those points very quickly and accurately, which is the critical part, and have a beautiful star. So we'll get this last side, and be sure you attach it this way and not this way. Yes, ask how I know. I've had to pull a star or two apart simply because I wasn't paying attention, and there is the problem. All right, so we can see this here, right? I'm going to show you. We're going to use our 1/4 inch seam, and I'm going to line this end up so I know we're together, and make sure that this center lines up. You don't want this fabric like that, and you don't want the back to be pulled down. You just want them to line up nice and even together so you get a good straight seam. And we're just going to sew with our 1/4 inch, Now we want to make sure we're going to be on this side of the point of the corner, and we're right in line with that here, so that looks really good. And run through, we're going to add this final piece, and then we're going to be finished. Some thread here raveling out, so I'm going to put this right in the corner. And let's see, I'm going to put that up there just a little bit. That back one's just a bit over. There we go. Now, because this is pressed that direction, I'm going to want to keep my finger here to remind myself that that seam needs to go in that direction. Because if it gets twisted at this point, then it gets messy to try and iron. And you can go back and clip the dog ears off after the fact. A lot of times I'll do that when I'm pressing or putting it together. So here we are. We have our pieces, our 3 rows, and we have this. And while you're doing, you take a look and make sure it looks like a star and you don't have those points on backwards. And there it is. So that makes a pretty star. So you can go ahead here and press your seams if you like. I just finger press them and sew them as we go. Now what I'm going to do here is this seam I'm going to sew, or I'm going to press towards the center. So these 2 seams, I'm going to have this seam allowance come towards the center. These, on the other hand, I'm going to have go to the outside. Now, I do, a lot of times I'll use my finger, but when I'm doing points, I want to make sure those points lay down. I have this nifty gadget, and I think it's called a seam presser. They also have seam rollers. I actually have a list of quilting gadgets on my Etsy page that I have in my favorites list. I don't find this online anymore. I bought this when I was making just small book binding, like souvenir books and things like that, scrapbooking kind of things. And this is great to fold the edge of paper, but it also works really well for fabric. And so I tend to, grab that. And the alternative is just use your fingernail. That works too. So, there's a lot of different ways. Like I said, you can also get these with a little roller. It's sort of like a 1-inch rolling pin. And that works pretty effectively. Okay, now, this is one of the tricky parts because we want this square to meet in the corner of this square. So we want the 4 seams to come together, and we have to nest them. So there's 2 things we need to do. First is make sure our seam is lined up, and I am going to cut that stitching, the chain piecing that I did, so you can see inside here. I'm going to cut this. There we go. And now when I fold this over, you can see how this lines up really well right there in that corner. So I'll fold this over so it's nice and flat and bring it over because I want that to be right on the side so this lines up evenly. And I am going to go ahead and, for this one, I'll put a pin here because there's a lot going on. So we're going to put that pin right there. Now, when I pin for something like this, when I'm nesting seams, I always try to put my first seam facing towards my needle. 2 reasons. Number 1, I can see that it's going the right way. I can pin it easily. But more importantly is as I'm sewing, that needle with the presser foot is going to nudge this seam down into this seam underneath. So I'll get a really good tight fit, and that's always wonderful. Now, the other thing I want to do is make sure that this one is going to work. But remember, these seams are both coming to the center. So while I put that one there towards the center, try and get my scissors in here, and this one's going to come out. I'll line them up just like this, take a peek, make sure they're right where they need to be, And then I'll go ahead and pin these. And again, I'll pin from that side because I want to make sure that seam allowance stays put as I'm sewing. And then when I get to here, I can just go ahead and make sure this is lined up, and I'll sew right above that point. Okay, so now we're ready. We'll go ahead and we'll sew this. We want to make sure these seam allowances are going in the right direction. We want to make sure that this corner fits nice and tight into that corner so that the corners line up. Otherwise, this seam will be cockeyed one direction or the other, and we want it to go right down the center. These are all little things that in and of themselves don't make a huge difference, but if you make all those mistakes on one quilt block, one star block, you'll be disappointed because it'll really look off. You'll be able to see that things just don't line up the way they should, and you'll be disappointed. So just, a few extra steps here and there. And initially it may take a little more time, but once you get the hang of it and once you know what you're looking for and what you want to do, then, oh, look at that. I ran out of bobbin thread. All right, now that we have a full bobbin and I can actually sew through, let's go ahead and start over. All right, so whoop, I lost my pin there. I'll go ahead and line that up nice. And there we go. And what I do want to show you, as I mentioned about, oh, my thread twisted there, making sure you've got that 1/4 inch, because that's going to bring this point inside, away from your seam allowance. So when you sew your 1/4 inch here, that point remains intact. So that's where, like I said, on the stars, or anytime you do triangles with points and things like that, you do want to watch your seam allowance. So, oops, got my thread caught on there. And now I want to make sure I come to this side, and that shouldn't be a problem. A lot of times I'll just use, like I said, my seam ripper or stiletto, and just hold things in place. And we're going to come up here so that this corner fits. Right now we have this all pinned and ready to go. Everything lines up nicely. And just get right there, and then bring this over here. I noticed that that sort of twisted a little bit on me, and then just sew right off the edge. And again, make sure these two corners line up so that your seam allowance is going to give you a nice even point. Just kind of trim that off as you go, and you see how that works right there. So we've got plenty of room. So here's our first, is that a thread? No, that's just the print, I guess. We have our first seam. We've got our star attached here. We do the last seam, and then we're going to be finished. So let me just sew this up real quick. Here we go. Our seam allowances together. Kind of bring this. It almost looks either this is a little big or this is a little short. So I'm going to split the difference. And I'm going to leave a little bit of space around this, but I'm still going to make sure it lines up right in that block, right in that square. And I want to make sure that this lines up here, which it does, and line up there. Okay. So sometimes in order to get things to be just perfectly aligned, you need to just adjust as you go and make sure it fits. And sometimes it may be a slight adjustment, simply because, it just depends on how things lie, what your seam allowance is, how square the cut is. There are a lot of variables. And if you know how to accommodate for a misstep here and there, then you'll be able to cover yourself easily. And those are some of the things that I want to try and show you. So we're going to come right over here, and we'll take a look behind and see how we left that little bit of a corner right there. So when we flip that seam over, it's going to look great. Now this one too came up a little short. So what I'm thinking is this flying geese came out large for whatever reason, and it's a bit wider. And so, like I said, I split the difference. So I'm going to put this one right here, make sure that lines up. I'll get to that seam so it's sewn where I want it to be. And then, yowzer, that's off quite a bit. So I'm going to tuck this so it's in the center right here. There we go. So we're going to take a little there and a little here. And I'm going to have to figure that one out as we go. We'll see how that one ends up. There we go. Right like that. And, well, yep, I've got almost a 1/4 inch. So I'll just have to take a narrow seam right there and it'll be fine. But look at, so our corners have lined up. Our points are inside. You know, like this one is particularly close. This one's a little wider. And I'm not worried about that because that's not something you see visually on a quilt unless you're inspecting every seam. And if someone's doing that kind of inspection, let them at it. That's fine. So here we are. It's a beautiful star, and I just need to make a few more, and our quilt will be ready. This is an easy one to do as long as you take your time and watch your seam allowances. All right, let's go ahead and get your stars finished, and we'll get this quilt put together. And here's the finished quilt with all those beautiful low volumes throughout the background, and the batik points on the stars really bring out the pattern and creates a lot of great design. And it's such a light and airy quilt. I just love how this all went together. I hope you get a chance to make your own no-waste flying geese and try some of these different pattern ideas and give it a try. I think you'll enjoy it. It's a great pattern to have in your toolbox, to have in your pattern box, that you can go ahead and add some interest to any of your quilts. I sure appreciate you being here today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll return and come back again. If you've enjoyed this, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. It's been my pleasure to be here. You all have a wonderful day today. Thank you.